All right, welcome to this next session of Secure Our Streets conference. My name is Scott Shahan. I'm the host for this session, and I'm looking forward to introduce our next speaker, which is Florian Lukavsky, he is the CTO of OneKey, and OneKey is a gold level sponsor for the conference today, so we thank him for that. As I bring him here on stage, I'm going to introduce him as well. So let me bring him on stage. Okay, so Florian, as I said, he's a CTO of OneKey. He started his hacker career at a young age, bypassing his parents' parental control that they wanted to put on his computer. And very interesting. That's how he got his start. So since then, he's reported numerous zero-day vulnerabilities responsibly to software vendors and has conducted hundreds of pen test security reviews of connected devices as a CREST certified ethical hacker. After building his offensive security teams in a number of countries, this is Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Switzerland, he founded OneKey. And today, Florian aids organizations with SBOM, security and compliance automation for connected devices as the CTO of OneKey, the leading European product security platform. So I'd like to welcome Florian to the stage. And as a quick note, I know Florian is coming to us from Austria, and a lot of his companies in Austria and Germany, I believe. So thank you, Florian. I'll exit the stage and looking forward to your talk.
So sorry, the unmute button was hiding behind my screen sharing control, but I've figured it out. I hope you can see my screen. I hope you can see me, can hear me. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's a great honor being here. Thank you also for all the people here in the session. Many people joining already. So yeah, let's get to it. Today we will be diving into the topic of SBOM and how to mine for relevant vulnerabilities in connected devices. And I want to start off with a question. So looking at all these company logos, all those brands, what do you think they will have in common? So you can use the chat for that to give up to provide some guesses. And I can spoil it already. So they have in common that they use a chip, a Wi-Fi chip provided by Realtek. We had a look, this was several years ago already. We had a look at the chip, or more precisely at the SDK that was delivered with the chip, so that provided interfaces to control, to connect, to speak with this chip. And within this SDK, we found numerous vulnerabilities. So we found a heap-based buffer overflow via the SSDP function. We found a stack-based buffer overflow via UPnP, so via the network interface, which scored a 9.8 on the CVSS scale, so critical vulnerability. A second critical vulnerability in some diagnostic tools where we identified command injection vulnerabilities, and multiple web-based vulnerabilities in the web interface that was shipped together with this SDK. So responsible security researchers that we are, we provided security advisories to Realtek, summarized our findings, our recommendations, how to remediate those issues, and responsibly disclose these vulnerabilities to the vendor after they fixed it. Took not too long, so they were fairly responsive. Back in August 2021, we released, so 2.5 years ago, we released a joint security advisory to inform the public that there's new patches around, that devices need to be upgraded, etc. So we also received good media coverage. So the Register, for example, was picking up on it. Many other tech outlets were also discussing this topic back then. So we thought, well, job well done. The internet is a little bit more secure. We got some vendors to fix critical security issues in connected devices. But it wasn't that easy. As it turned out, beginning of this year, when a report was published by Fortinet, they discovered that more than 134 million attempts to exploit the exact vulnerabilities that we had identified. So those vulnerabilities were picked up by malicious actors, put into botnets, put into malware, and exploited at scale, at a massive scale. And it was one of the highest ranking exploited vulnerability in the second half of 2022. So this was quite scary. So what we found out, that while Realtek had issued a patch and had fixed the issue in their code base, many of the vendors that relied on Realtek didn't update their dependencies, didn't apply the patch in their products. So still today, there's a lot of unpatched products vulnerable to those issues out there. And this reminds me of one of my favorite XKCD comics that illustrates the modern digital infrastructure. And down here, in this case, a Realtek SDK that if this is broken, half of modern society crumbles. And Realtek is by no means a exception here. So when we look into supply chain risks, we have multiple examples of that. So for the ones of us that are in the industry for longer already, I'm sure you will remember Heartbleed, which happened about a decade ago, a critical vulnerability in OpenSSL, which allowed remote attackers to retrieve sensitive information such as passwords, encryption keys, etc., from the server memory. And OpenSSL, a dependency that you will find everywhere. Also, 2 years ago, Log4j, I'm sure this vulnerability screwed with the Christmas plans of many sysadmins and DevOps teams. A seemingly unimportant dependencies that was responsible for collecting log files and sharing them was prone to a critical vulnerability that allowed a remote command execution and was exploited at scale. And again, a dependency that you will find in virtually every Java application. But we can also go deeper. With their labs, for example, they discovered 33 vulnerabilities in TCP stacks, in connection stacks that are used by millions of IoT and OT devices. They called them Amnesia 33. So another example of supply chain attacks. or supply chain risks, where a vulnerability in a dependency that you have will cause risk, will cause vulnerability to critical issues. And dealing with software bill of materials, dealing with those supply chain issues, having the capabilities is also a requirement out of UNR 155, which demands that monitoring activities are in place so that you can receive and act on relevant information regarding cyber attacks. And you also have to demonstrate that those processes are actually working, and that you can react in a timely manner to any new vulnerabilities that would affect you or any of your suppliers. So also a requirement for the automotive industry. So the first step in order to be able to do that, the first step is to actually have a strong foundation, look into software bill of materials, so to have a sense on what is actually in the application, what dependencies you have. So the software bill of material will typically contain a reference to the supplier, component name, what version is used, any other unique identifiers, which are summarized as a CPE, so a unique identifier for a software component. And since you want to automate that, there are several formats out there already that standardize it. SWIT is not that popular anymore, so that this was one of the early projects by NIST. Later came SPDX from the Linux Foundations, which was initially mainly developed with a free and open source license management perspective, but is now switching over to cover more security aspects as well. And the new kid on the block, which gained in popularity over the last year, Cyclone DX. So a very active and well-maintained OWASP project. So those are some of the formats that you can use to store and exchange SBOM information. And you have multiple sources to generate the SBOM. So the easiest and the most convenient, of course, would be to receive the SBOM along with the software packages from your supplier. So this would be the dream scenario, of course. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. So you will also need to look into other areas to, on the one side, validate what your suppliers are telling you. So to have controls in place to make sure that they are really telling you the truth. And on the other side, also to fill gaps that they may have, and complete the picture. So other sources that you may have is to tap into metadata that is delivered as part of your software. So to tap into package managers, for example, or other metadata that may be available. If your suppliers provide the source code, this will be a good source as well to identify any third-party libraries, any dependencies that may be in the code. And finally, this is both the entire truth, but also one of the most complex sources for SBOM would be compiled binaries. So the code that you're actually running to investigate what kind of dependencies, what kind of nifty secrets lurk in there. So those are the options that you will have available. And looking at vulnerabilities, and Sorry for this. For the slide misalignment. So looking at vulnerabilities, in the next step, you then want to kind of merge vulnerability sources and SBOM sources to see which of the dependencies are vulnerable to which vulnerabilities. So the most popular and the most widely used vulnerability database is the NVD, the US National Vulnerability Database, which is maintained by MITRE, which regular publishes CVE vulnerabilities with CVE references. We can also tap into security bulletins from the suppliers, so the release notes, the security advisories that the suppliers themselves release. We can also apply automated vulnerability scans and make use of DAST or SAST tools to further tap into the applications, into the devices and into the firmware to see what kind of vulnerabilities may be affecting it. If we if we put this together, we are faced with a lot of challenges. For example, of course. So for example, some vendors they may not reference third-party packages or may not include third-party libraries and kind of declare them as third-party libraries, but they may just copy and paste some functions or some portions of the source code, so to kind of vendor in software components. So with this, it's very difficult to identify and also to maintain the source code, because any update to the version, applying any patches, will be very challenging in this context. The next challenge is closely linked to that. So to have statically linked libraries. So where libraries in Linux systems, for example, are not dynamically loaded, but they're built into the binary. They're hard-coded into the binary, and this is also the case for many real-time operating systems such as in QNX binaries. We see this a lot, but also for AutoSAR. This is a common practice to have one big binary with dependencies statically linked into it. The next challenge is when we have runtime fetched libraries. So this is very common for JavaScript-based applications, for example, that certain libraries or certain frameworks are loaded at runtime and are fetched from some content distribution networks and are not actually distributed as part of the application. So having dependencies kind of outside of the scope that you're looking at during the analysis time. Then there's also transient software components. So software components that don't actually end up in the final product or don't leave any traces there, but that are used to configure or used to compile the application, which may lead to vulnerabilities as well, but where it's difficult to find traces of these dependencies. And then, of course, there's naming conventions, issues with inaccurate versioning, so to making sure that everyone speaks of the same things and that there's good references, unique references to software components, to vulnerabilities, etc. So huge challenges there as well. And yeah, the next challenge, of course, is the sheer number of vulnerabilities that we are dealing with. So if we look at the past, I don't know, 1.5 decades or so, we see that the number of vulnerabilities steadily increased. Back in, I think it was in 2016, when when MITRE also changed the format of CVE numbers, which used to be a 4-digit reference in a given year. And they expanded it to a 5-digit reference to account for more than 10,000 vulnerabilities in a given year. So last year we had more than 25,000 vulnerabilities being reported. And yeah, that's if my math isn't off, that's more than 150 vulnerabilities per day. So that's a huge amount of vulnerabilities. If you had to go through that manually, this would take a lot of time. So it's essential and crucial to further limit the number of vulnerabilities that we want to investigate that are actually relevant in our case. So if we look at all vulnerabilities that are available, I mean, the most obvious reduction is, of course, to filter for CVEs that actually affect the software components that I'm using. So I've built up a thorough software bill of material, so I know exactly which dependencies or which version I'm using. So this would be the first restriction. But within this number, I can still do better. So I can look for CVEs that are actually within my threat model that pose a high enough risk, for example, that I care about it. Or if I have restrictions in place that the users of the system don't get access to the command line, for example, I could decide that this serves as a mitigation and I don't care about vulnerabilities that are locally exploited. So this is another important reduction. The second reduction that we can do, or actually the third reduction that we can do, is to check if this CVE is actually affecting the product in the given configuration. And in the next slide, I have also brought an example for that. So where based on settings, based on options that I'm using, based on features that I'm using in the system, a vulnerability that may affect the product or the dependency in general may not affect this very configuration or this instance of product. So this is another possibility to further restrict the number of vulnerabilities that I would need to look at, where I would need to do a impact assessment on to see if it's actually necessary to fix the vulnerability or to apply patches or mitigations. And finally, I can also take into consideration risk factors. So to see if the vulnerability is being exploited, if there's records of exploitation at the moment. So CISA, for example, they regularly publish vulnerabilities that are under active exploitations. There's a EPSS score provided by FIRST that gives or that calculates, provides a probability that certain vulnerabilities are exploited based on attacks seen in the wild. So this is another option that I can take into consideration. So in a world where I don't have endless time to fix every vulnerability, and where I'm forced to make prioritization and to focus on the high risk vulnerabilities first, this is the intersection that I want to be looking at first. So the vulnerabilities that are actually relevant to me, that affect um, the application, the device in the configuration that I'm using it in, that that are within my threat model, and that are also being exploited. So where there's a high likelihood that this vulnerability will actually cause harm or cause damage. And if we look at a example, I promised an example before regarding configuration. So if we look at CVE 2021 31884, which was published back in 2021. So this was a critical vulnerability. So score of 9.8. This is as high as it gets. So the CVSS scale ends at 10. And so from that perspective, it is critical enough that we should pay close attention to. And it was found to affect capital V star. It was found to affect nucleus underscore net. So if if I have built my device on such an operating system, so which is also an AUTOSAR compliant operating system, I should pay even more attention, because it's also an application that is affecting me. But if I now take a closer look at the description, I will see that the vulnerability requires or depends on Ethernet options being enabled. Depends on a DHCP client being involved. So if I know that my device, while it is based on capital B star, for example, but it's only operating in a CAN environment, I can disregard this vulnerability, because if I don't support Ethernet, I won't be affected by an issue that affects the Ethernet portion of things. So this will be a very powerful tool to further reduce the vulnerabilities that will be relevant for me, and to have an impact assessment to filter out such vulnerabilities. So if we want to put all of it together, we have identified that we need to have a strong baseline, strong fundamentals, so to have good information, good insights into what third-party software components we are using, what our device is made up of, or what kind of dependencies are in there, is the device relying on. We then need to collect vulnerabilities from various sources, such as the CVE database, for example. We need to collect sources from security bulletins, penetration testing resources can go in there, automated security scanning results can go in there. But when we have collected this huge bag of vulnerabilities that we will need to sift through, having a triage in place will be essential. So to make sure that we identify and deal with the vulnerabilities that are actually affecting us. and to automate and also to inform upstream or downstream suppliers about that. There's also standardized formats such as VEX, vulnerability exchange, and lately also the CSAF standard, which is a machine readable format for security advisories, is advertised and promoted a lot. Then, after I have identified the vulnerabilities that are relevant to me, that affect me, I can go into the mitigation phase. So to make sure that I apply fixes, patches to those vulnerabilities and roll out those updates in a timely manner to my entire product base. So to make sure that those vulnerabilities cannot be exploited in the wild anymore. And finally, this is not a one-time effort, but should be turned into a continuous process, or actually must be turned into a continuous process, so that you can continuously monitor for new vulnerabilities, for any information that may be relevant in that context and may impact the security of the devices. And yeah, so conclusion before we head over to the Q&A. Conclusion of the talk is I cannot stress it enough. The basis for each vulnerability is a solid SBOM. If you don't have transparency into what you're dealing with, you will run blind and you will not know which vulnerabilities may affect you and which vulnerabilities you would need to deal with. Secondly, determine the configuration. Determine your threat model. Make sure to have possibilities to further reduce, to further mark the relevance of the vulnerabilities that you're dealing with. But make sure to document also the reasons why you disregard certain vulnerabilities, why your assessment concludes that certain vulnerabilities may not be affecting you. And then conduct impact assessments to reduce the number of vulnerabilities further, so that you don't have to fix thousands of vulnerabilities, but that it will be sufficient to fix a few dozen. And with this conclusion, I would like to hand over the Q&A session. And after this talk, I will also be present at our booth. So make sure to visit us there. We'll be looking forward to that as well. And I see Scott is here already. We are ready to take your questions.
First off, thank you, Florian, for your presentation. We do have a couple questions for you over here. I'm going to go to the highest voted question and show it on the stage. So this is from Shahid. I'm gonna mispronounce your last name. I just know it, so I'm gonna say Shahid. What are tools to find open source software? I believe that's OSS or vulnerabilities in embedded software. Maybe you could clarify if OSS is not the acronym that I used. But does that question make sense to you, Florian?
Yes, this question makes perfect sense to me. So there's different tools available for that. There's a couple of open source tools available, such as Ember, for example. We at OneKey we provide a commercial tool that is able or capable of identifying vulnerabilities and open source software dependencies in embedded firmware as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Shahid. And I see Shahid is coming from Pune in India. I've worked with several people from there. Very, very good place. All right, we'll go to the next question. I'll bring up here on stage. This also, yep, from Shahid again. Do we have a vulnerability database? Regulations say to keep track on same periodically. So how do we ensure we are on track? So yeah, what is your response to this?
Yeah. I mean, this is the second challenge. So the first challenge is to know what software components you're actually dealing with, what your SBOM is, and the second is to maintain a large enough vulnerability database, so to tap into relevant sources to identify vulnerabilities. So there's multiple sources that can go into your vulnerability database. The easiest and would be NVD, and there's also many vulnerability databases provided for other countries. In China, for example, there's dedicated vulnerability databases. Then we can also look at the advisory sites, release notes from vendors. You can also do additional security checks yourself. So if you have penetration testing teams, if you run any automated security tools, these vulnerabilities will feed into your database as well. So there's multiple sources that you could and also should use to build your vulnerability database.
Are you aware of any like dark web common databases, anything that is commonly used on the dark web? I know there are services that are offered where companies will offer to search the dark web for your particular products and indicators of like different libraries that you're using. Anything that you know of there?
I'm not aware of like any large scale vulnerability databases. I mean, as part of several botnets, for example, they are building on more and more exploitable vulnerabilities as well. So one example which I've shown in my intro, but I'm not aware of any dark web database that would serve as a good source for vulnerability database.
Okay. The next question is from me, and this was I didn't know about SBOMs. When you're building this SBOM information, does it also tell you what compile time options were present? Like if you're including stack canaries or position independent executables, something like that. Is that all present in the SBOM?
Not necessarily. I mean, you can you have the option to add it. So the baseline idea for an SBOM is to provide references to software components that are within an application. There is also the possibility to extend this to provide hashes of the binaries, for example, that belong to this software component. And there you could also add information such as compile time options that have been used. You can also extend your SBOM, although that's a little bit disputed, but you can also extend your SBOM with vulnerability information. So to add VEX, for example, into your SBOM to indicate which vulnerabilities are or are not applicable to the specific software component based on the way or based on the configuration that you're using.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have a few more for you. This is more on the, do you have any regulations? Are there any regulations that are out there where a company would have penalties for ignoring active CVEs exploited on their products? Like if they have this present, they haven't patched it, or like you mentioned in your presentation, if you just have maybe just some CVEs, they're not actively exploited, but are there any fines from any regulation bodies that are currently happening?
Yeah. I mean, the UNR is mandating security. But speaking of fines and regulation, the European Union is currently preparing the Cyber Resilience Act, which will define hefty fines, which can raise up to 2.5% of the global annual revenue of a company if security of connected products or any products with digital elements, as they refer to it, if the security is neglected or not taken seriously.
Yeah, my daughter has one of those bedtime story connected devices, and I think about that. And I've heard other kids' products where they've had them be hacked, and yeah, that's always on the back of my mind with these connected products and how they'll affect our families' lives and our
Yes.
lives. One question about SBOMs. So are these publicly posted? I mean, are the hackers going to see these as well, the SBOMs?
I mean, the industry is demanding more transparency in that regard. And I mean, it will certainly differ if you're looking at B2B products, such as in the automotive industry. You will find less information publicly about such devices. But if you look at B2C devices, there the trend is towards more transparency, also providing SBOM. I mean, from a license perspective, you were kind of forced already to mention which software components you rely on. But those license information was usually not provided in a very structured or well-readable way. So yeah, I can see the industry adapting there. And to me, the advantage of organizations having the transparency into the SBOM and incorporating this information into the risk management outweighs the advantage that an attacker may have to save a little bit of time to have the SBOM presented to them. Because if an attacker wants to know, he can find out the SBOM anyway, investing a little bit of effort.
Okay, so we have one last question for you before we wrap up this session. What about the skeptics that may say SBOM is not going to help with zero-day exploits anyways?
That's true. But zero-day exploits make up a fraction of actively exploited vulnerabilities or cause a fraction of incidents. I would argue that, I mean, I don't have any exact numbers, but 90+% of the attacks don't rely on 0 days. They rely on well-known vulnerabilities
Just that haven't been patched.
If we had decent patch management, if we had decent security configuration, could be mitigated. So if we live in a world where a 0-day vulnerability is necessary to launch a successful cyber attack, this will be a good world.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Florian. I appreciate. Thank you for the presentation today. Thank you for the question and answer. And yeah, if you guys can give him some props, I'm seeing lots of thumbs up and applause on the chat. So
thank you very much.
As a reminder, if you would like to meet with Florian, OneKey has sponsored this SOS conference. So he's not going to be in the lounge. He's going to be in his company booth, in the sponsor booth. So if you'd like to meet with him after this, please go to the booth for OneKey. I was chatting with Max, who's also from OneKey earlier, and just jump in there, They're great guys, very friendly. So, and yeah, don't be shy. So yeah, we will now take a break for about 20 minutes. You can have 20 minutes to go look at the booths, look at the rest of the conference, and we'll meet back in about 20 minutes. So thank you again, Florian.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Cheers. All right, bye-bye.